Fate was bullied every day until he awakened the true power of his SS rank skill. Fate is your typical disgusting loser with the job of holding a flag post in front of the castle walls. He's been there the whole day and complains about how starving he is feeling right now. He then notices a group of 4 adventurers passing nearby. One of them brags about hitting level 6 while doing their hunt a few hours ago. There was a merchant cart carrying some goods until it was attacked by a group of goblins. The goblins jumped onto the cart, but luckily the same adventurers were close. Their leader rode a horse, ensuring the archer was protected while shooting the goblins down, and they would take care of the ones who got close to them. The long-haired dude easily deals with some monsters with his quick and smooth skills, while the huge dude did his best impression of Hulk Smash with his double-handed axe. After that, they returned to the city, where Hulk Smash brags about his level up. The group then talked about dividing the spoils of battle, but that only made Fate jealous. Despite that feeling, he knows he won't ever be able to be an adventurer. His stomach starts growling again, and he thinks he is useless. He's hungry, he has a stupid job, and his unique skill is worthless. Let's be fair, his stats are all 1, and his skill is gluttony. Despite his complaints, he knows he should be grateful to even have a job. Later that day, the city is full of life. The other group is trying to get better weapons until the announcement that the Holy Knights are coming through. The adventurers immediately hide themselves from the trio of Holy Knights. While the trio walks past, an orange rolls over to the knight's boot. The merchant apologizes for it and tries to pick it up. However, the Holy Knight kicks the merchant away. The poor man tries to apologize again, but the Holy Knights start bullying him even more. They claim the merchant is insulting them, and for that reason, they should take his head. The poor man apologizes again, but the leader of the trio tells the other 2 to stop. Before leaving, he tells the merchant to not let the same thing happen again. The trio walks away, calling the old man lucky. The group of adventurers were watching everything, but they find it hard to believe that Lady Roxy is a holy knight like them. We return to our useless Fate, who's still complaining about his hunger. Luckily, his shift is almost over, until the trio arrives. They ask if Fate did a proper job to fill in for them today. Fate lowers his head and confirms he did. The leader of the trio then drops a few coins on the floor as payment and tells Fate to pick it up. Fate complies and slowly starts picking the coins. Yet, one of the Holy Knights steps on his hand. He starts insulting Fate, saying that he is so filthy that he didn't notice him. And as you expect, Fate is a bullied person who has no way to fight back. His stomach makes noise again, making the leader of the trio mad. He claims that this noise makes it seem like they don't feed him. They ask if Fate is trying to embarrass the Vileric family and kick him away. The guy kicks Fate a few more times, and the girl joins in. She starts calling Fate's skill useless and says that he only survives because they give him money. In his mind, Fate explains that in this world, everyone's worth depends on the special powers they got from gods. They call them skills. The trio leader claims that if Fate slacks off, the result will reflect on them, his employers. The guy then orders Fate to get up, but when he tries, the other guy steps on his face and asks him to hurry up. They increase their bullying, claiming that he needs to be disciplined for failing to comply with orders. However, a voice from afar tells them to stop. This is the famous Lady Roxy Hart. She complains in her elegant way that holy knights shouldn't abuse the people they swore to protect. The trio gets annoyed just by her presence. Roxy continues explaining that watching the gate is an honorable duty for a holy knight, and that's the trio's duty to watch the stupid entrance. The leader claims it's also his duty to provide employment to useless people like Fate. She then asks why he is treating Fate like that. The guy twists her words and tells the others they will be leaving. Roxy walks toward Fate and asks if he's okay while trying to get him up. She uses her handkerchief to clean up his injuries, but Fate notices the way the trio's leader is looking at Roxy. She finishes cleaning him up and he thanks her for her help. Roxy replies that she's only doing what a holy knight should do. She then says that his shift is over and hers will begin. Fate gives her the pole, and Roxy asks him to tell her if the trio continues to do the same bullying. Fate replies that he's already used to it and leaves. Later at night, Fate is in the bar thinking about Roxy's words, but Fate knows that the trio might take revenge on her, so he decides to not involve her in this thing. The bar owner comes to him and asks if the trio did the same as usual. He tells Fate if this keeps up, he will end up like the last guy. He says the trio gives their employees endless abuse and brutal labor, but they cannot prove it because the former employees didn't live enough to tell. Fate ignores the advice and thanks for the meal. The bar dude then says he will pray so that Fate doesn't end up like that. Meanwhile, Fate walks on the streets and his stomach is making noise again. Turns out his skill allows him to be always hungry. He calls that skill stupid and wishes he could have been born with something more useful. Not something that allowed him to become a holy knight, but something that could allow him to be a warrior, merchant, or craftsman. And that's the reality of this world. If his skill is trash, he will also be considered trash. Fate then suddenly stops and notices some thieves climbing up the walls. He starts running back to alert Roxy about the situation. Upon hearing the news, Roxy gives him the pool and says she will apprehend the thieves. He wishes her good luck, and she heads inside. Fate hears blades clashing and screams until they suddenly stop. He then sees from the distance an injured thief. Fate starts to run away, but he stops after remembering that Roxy trusted him with this. He decides to confront the thief head-on and uses the spear pole to send him to the next life. Suddenly, everything around Fate starts to get dark. He hears a voice saying that his gluttony skill has been activated and that his stats are being updated. When he checks them, he sees that every single one is over 100. He also gained 2 new skills, Identify and Telepathy. He's still confused that his skill activated, and drops the pole. He doesn't understand what just happened. Roxy then comes running toward him to check if he got hurt by the thief. She notices that he doesn't look well, and she is worried. She never said that, but Fate managed to read her thoughts. He claims he isn't hurt and hears her thoughts again when she expresses relief. She then says that she will have to report the situation to her superiors. But Fate is more confused because he cannot hear her thoughts anymore. Fate tells her to take the credit all to herself because the trio would cause problems if they knew he dealt with a thief. She decides to thank him for helping her succeed in her duty and asks if he would like to work for her family. She tells him that he will meet his end if he keeps working for the trio, so he should work for her family, who would treat him fairly. Fate starts to consider the situation. Does he want to continue being treated like trash? Or does he want to have a bright future by working for Roxy? Well, he then says that if he doesn't do this job, another guy will come and suffer the same. Roxy explains the Holy Knights need to guard the entrance, not other people. In the end, he agrees to work for her. He heads back home and is still confused by his status changes. He doesn't know what his new skills are, but thinks that telepathy is what allowed him to hear Roxy's thoughts. He then starts to worry about his gluttony skill activation and what's going on with his body. But he quickly brushes it off because he can now beat monsters, probably. The next day, Fate goes to the shopping street and starts looking for a weapon. However, his budget is only 2 coins. The merchant tells him off because he won't even be able to buy a butter knife with that change. Fate came to this city 5 years ago, but he could only save up those 2 coins by working under poor conditions. The merchant then tells him that if he wants, he can have the trash weapons inside the barrel. He decides to check the blades and uses his Identify skill to check every single blade. Everything is pretty trash until he grabs the one on the back. He identifies it and thinks this blade is filthy and is being treated like trash, just like him. Suddenly, the swords start talking. Fate starts to panic but tries to not make a scene. His skill allows him to know the name of the sword, Greed. The sword then tells him that if Fate buys it, the sword will make him stronger. The sword then calls him Gluttony. Fate is confused about how the sword knows. The sword explains they have a lot in common. Fate then makes his decision and buys the sword. Meanwhile, the trio is complaining because Roxy is trying to hire Fate without asking them. The girl wants to teach Roxy a lesson, but their leader couldn't care less. After all, there are more people who need a trashy job. The girl continues to complain about Roxy, but the guy explains that Roxy's family and theirs are part of the great 5 families that support the kingdom. So, acting against her will raise some problems. The guy then says it's time for him to go to the military district. But the girl is confused. She asks why he cares so much about it. The guy then explains he wants to know about the study on how to become immortal. The girl is confused and starts laughing it off while the leader walks away. Meanwhile, Fate goes to the outskirts of the city with his new sword. The sword keeps repeating his name, just because it wants to memorize it. The sword then says that enemies come, and Fate starts to panic. A goblin jumps on him, but Fate's eyes change, and he slices the goblin in one slash. The other voice speaks again, explaining that Gluttony was activated and will increase his stats. He also gained the Strength Boost skill. Fate is confused that this happened again, but there are more goblins around. Greed starts laughing and explains that goblins always appear in groups. They all dash to attack Fate, but he manages to parry and slice them one after one. His gluttony skill keeps activating every time he defeats a goblin. A few hours later, Fate finally manages to defeat hundreds of goblins. He now has a few more skills, but his stats are now crazy. His lowest stat is nearly 500, and his strength is triple of that. Greed then asks if Fate stopped being hungry. Fate is initially confused, but he realizes that his stomach never made noise today. Fate then asks Greed what this is all about. He thought that people could only have the skills they were born with. Greed explains it's all because of gluttony. Normally, people must fight and win battles to increase their stats or level up. However, gluttony is a cheat skill. It steals the stats and skills of whatever he defeats. The only problem is that he cannot get experience and level up. Fate asks how Greed knows about it, and the sword explains they're the same. Despite being confused, Fate notices the adventurers group coming in his direction. Greed tells him that he shouldn't let people know about his gluttony skill because it defies the divine law. Fate realizes what this means and decides that he cannot party up. He must always fight alone. Greed then tells him that he's not alone, because Greed is with him. Fate accepts those words and decides to return. Yet, Greed stops him from returning without collecting the goblin's ears. Fate is confused, but Greed explains that he will get paid if he sells them. Fate starts regretting killing so many goblins but manages to do it and get paid. He managed to earn 3 silver and 80 bronze coins and decided to get some meat for dinner. Greed stops him, telling him to do maintenance on him first. Fate still decides to get dinner first, but he bumps into a shady guy coming from a dark alley. There's a little girl with the shady guy. She touches Fate, and he hears her voice begging for his help. He sees her eyes shaking in fear, and the guy starts pulling the girl while walking away. Fate then uses his skill to identify the shady guy's skills, however it quickly disappears. Greed explains the guy has a conceal ability, which hides everything from identify. Greed asks what Fate will do, and he reveals that he will save the girl. The girl ends up in a warehouse, chained against the wall. The guy starts mocking her, telling that she will become a toy for the Holy Knights. Fate is watching closely, but Greed stops him from moving. Greed explains that Guy is stronger than him and that he should turn away. But Fate wants to help anyone he sees suffering in front of him, especially because he now has the power to do it. We then see an orphanage. The nun explains to the kids how Holy Laplace created their world. The old lady then claims that their god left their world and gave people some special powers. She asks if the young kids know the name of those powers, and they respond skills. The nun then tells the kids to thank Holy Laplace for their meal. The kids comply, and they start munching down on that depressive meal. However, one hasn't touched his food yet. The nun asks if he's feeling alright, and the boy simply says that Holy Laplace doesn't play fair. He explains that holy knights and warriors have amazing skills, but the young boy thinks he was abandoned because of his weak skill. Somehow the nun thinks the kid will be cheered up when she explains that in the old times, nobody had skills. At that time there was also no stats or even monster. It was a place where everyone was equal. The boy tears down wishing he was born in that world. The nun comforts the kid, but another one comes rushing in. She explains they couldn't find the girl who disappeared, so they will search for her in the city. The missing girl is the same one that was captured by the bad guy. The guy kicks the pole that she's chained to, telling her to cry and scream. He claims she will become a toy of the Holy Knights, but the girl still doesn't make any noise. The guy stops and starts walking away, giving the girl a chance to sob. She then hears some footsteps, but it's Fate, telling her she will be alright. He frees her from the chains and tells her to hurry up and escape. However, the other guy has returned. The guy explains he sometimes runs into guys like Fate, pathetic, useless dudes who think they're some sort of hero of justice. Fate simply smiles at the girl and pulls out Greed to fight the bad guy. The guy mocks Fate, asking if he will be able to fight while protecting the girl. He starts getting closer, and the girl ends up holding onto Fate's shirt in fear. Fate thinks he needs to get her to safety, but he doesn't know where. Greed has an idea and tells Fate to back away because the other guy thinks Fate is weaker than himself. Therefore, Greed wants Fate to take advantage of the guy's confidence. Fate follows the instructions and starts running away with the girl. The guy slowly follows them and tells he will kill Fate if he knocks the boxes down. He then tries to make Fate angry, explaining the girl will become obedient when she sees Fate's body out of soul. Fate manages to reach the endpoint, and Greed tells him it's now the time to attack. Fate then knocks the boxes where the other guy is passing by and uses them to jump and attack him. The guy manages to dodge, only taking a scratch on his cheek. The guy then starts to get serious, and his sword starts to glow. Greed knows that skill will be a problem and tells Fate to strike the guy down through his weapon. Fate uses the boxes again to leap toward the guy and manages to not only cut his sword in half but also slice the guy up. While the guy is still alive, Fate asks what he meant about bringing the girl to the Holy Knights. He questions who ordered the guy to kidnap the girl, but the guy refuses to answer. So, Fate decides to stab his wound and torture him with pain. After some seconds, the guy agrees to reveal who hired him. It was Otto Vileric, the guy who randomly used to beat Fate. Turns out the guy is a crazy dude who likes to show orphan kids some archery skills. But instead of shooting apples, he's shooting brains. Fate then takes the girl outside, telling her she will be fine from now on. His stomach starts making noise, and Greed starts to mock him. He invites her to eat something and asks for the girl's name. Sahara, she says. He takes Saraha to the street stalls and gets some meat sticks. The girl immediately starts digging in and explains this is the first time she had meat. She then suddenly starts to tear down for no reason, but Fate understands her and gives her his share. He then takes her back to the orphanage, where she reunites with the nuns. They thank Fate for helping Sahara, but he becomes confused. They ask if everything is alright, but he simply replies that nobody has ever thanked him before because he has a trash skill. The girl is confused and asks about it. Fate explains his skill simply makes him hungry. He then gets closer and tries to encourage Sahara. He tells her that no matter how hard things get, if she can laugh them off, she will end up finding happiness someday or not. Those are the same words his father told him when he was still a kid. He didn't understand them at that time, but they helped him over the years. He then walks away, and Greed explains that not only his stats increased, but he also got the one-handed sword technique. He congratulates Fate for his new skill, but Fate is confused. Greed explains this is a technical skill that allows him to get tech arts. They're literally secret techniques. In this case, he can attack twice at the same time. Fate is initially impressed, but he then realizes that if the guy managed to hit the skill, he would be sliced into 3 right now. Fate complains to Greed that he should have warned him before, but Greed simply calls Fate a hero who is trying to save a girl. Fate says he's not a hero and reveals he won't have dealt with the guy if he knew about his skill. Greed then explains that battles come down to luck of the moment, so the stronger person doesn't always win. Fate then makes up his new goal, to become strong enough and avoid winning without getting lucky. Greed then asks about tomorrow, since it will be Fate's first day working for the Hearts. Fate confirms, and Greed asks if he's going to show up looking like a pleb. This reminds Fate that he forgot to buy new clothes. Meanwhile, in a bar, there's an old man revealing the news that Sir Mason was struck down by a divine dragon in Galia. The barman asks what will happen to the Hart family, and the old man replies that Roxy will succeed him. The main problem is that Sir Mason was keeping the Holy Knights in check, if you can call it that, and the old man isn't sure she can keep them in line. The barman replies the Vilaric siblings are pretty trash, and he'd rather talk about something more pleasing. The old man then asks about Fate, and the barman replies he used to drop by every day after work. The next day, Fate arrives at the Holy Knight district, looking fresh. Upon getting close, he realizes Roxy lives in a huge mansion. He ends up meeting her by the fountain, and she smiles, explaining she was waiting for him. However, Fate doesn't reply. He's smitten by her beauty. He tells her she's pretty, and she gets shy. She then takes him inside on a tour, and her first stop is in front of a grave. Turns out this is her father, and she's introducing Fate to him. Fate is initially confused. She explains it happened 5 days ago when he met a divine dragon. Fate remembers about Galia. It's a continent dominated by monsters, and one of the Holy Knights' duties is to keep those monsters contained. She explains that it was her family's duty to contain the monsters this year. Despite being a dangerous task, it shouldn't be deadly. Still, a divine dragon that had been missing for 1,000 years suddenly appeared, and her father went to another world. Fate realizes that she's been suffering for the past couple of days, but she still looked out for him. He starts to feel sad, but she tells him not to. She's the new family leader and says they will work together to make it a joyful place. Fate accepts her words and almost shakes her hand, but he realizes that it will activate telepathy, so he points to somewhere else. Luckily, the maid chef, Haru, appears in that same place. Roxy introduces the two to each other, and she immediately starts threatening Fate, telling him to behave like a proper servant. But first, they must have lunch. Fate starts devouring some meat and acting like a guy who only ate once in his life. Haru, of course, gets annoyed because that's not how a proper servant should behave. Turns out, Fate is later tasked with trimming the bushes every day. He must keep them tidy and clean for a whole week. The other servants mention he should take some breaks and not overwork, but they also mention they always thought Fate was a weirdo because he talks to his sword. Plus, he behaves like a maniac when he eats meat. Fate only answers the meat part, explaining the last time he ate it was 5 years ago. The old servants start laughing it off until Fate's stomach starts making noise. They tell him they just had lunch and ask if he did eat. Haru then appears, explaining that Roxy wants to see him. He follows Haru but finds it weird about his stomach situation. Haru takes him to another part of the garden, where he meets Roxy. She gives him some tea and asks how he's been adapting to his job. But Fate is only thinking about his stomach. He's feeling even hungrier every second. Roxy literally shouts Faye several times until he returns to reality. That was the same name his father used to call him. He explained it to her and she asked about him. He reveals that his father died in a monster hunt. He asks her why she called him Faye, but she simply calls it a nickname for fate. And since he's been working for her, he's literally family. The guy misunderstands the whole thing, like a teenager who just saw a girl smile at him. Suddenly, he starts to feel dizzy and collapses. He wakes up in his room at night and reads a note. It's from Roxy, asking him to take a day off and rest. Fate decides to ask Greed why he's feeling hungrier, and the reason why he collapsed. Greed is surprised that Fate is only asking about that right now. He's been feeling hungrier for quite some time, but he's been able to control it until today. Greed explains that once the gluttony skill gets a taste of souls, it cannot be stopped. Fate is confused, but Greed explains the more he devours, the stronger he will get. But that will also make him want to devour more and more. By activating his skill, he will be destined to hunt and devour souls until his last day alive. Fate asks what will happen if he doesn't. Greed explains there's only two possibilities. He will either starve to death, or he will lose control and go on a rampage, putting everyone in danger. Fate is shocked because that will make him a monster. Greed then gives him some advice. When Fate's hunger approaches its limits, it will be visible in his eyes. Fate then checks his reflection in the mirror and finds out he has a Sharingan from Wish. Without any option, Fate decides to head out of the city at night to hunt. He notices that for some reason, all the warriors around smell delicious. Greed explains that is because of his hunger boost being activated. He also explains that's the reason Fate's eyes are red, and that it's a power that makes his gluttony skill more effective. With this, he will have better night vision, be able to track his prey by scent, while also terrifying and paralyzing weaker prey. Fate finally manages to find a group of goblins, and notices that his skill made them stop moving. He slices through the goblins with ease and smiles like a maniac. However, small goblins aren't enough to satisfy him. Greed tells him to head over to the hobgoblin forests. He follows those instructions and he meets some hobgoblins. He starts slicing them up, but it's never enough to free him from his hunger. After a huge hunt, he finally manages to stop feeling hungry. He doesn't want to feel like this again. Greed tells him that he must hunt monsters from time to time. Suddenly, the ground starts shaking. Fate hides and notices a huge monster carrying a human in hand. Greed explains this is a goblin king. Fate's eyes immediately change, and Greed explains they have similar stats, but the goblin has health regeneration. Greed explains it heals the wounds, enabling it to fight for a long period of time. The goblin king sits down and enjoys his human dessert. This gives Fate the opportunity to climb a tree and strike the goblin king's arm. However, Fate gets distracted to see the human dessert laying on the ground. The monster tries to smash him, but Fate manages to dodge its hits. He's clearly afraid of the attacks, but Greed tells him to trust him and rush in. Fate follows and manages to not only block the monster's attacks but also slice him down. The gluttony skill activates again, making Fate reach a whole new level. He now has several skills, and all his starts reach 5 digits. He then sits down, exhausted, and Greed says that the real deal will begin now. He explains that Fate's stats can now use Greed's first level. Fate is confused, but Greed says it's another form. Greed explains that he can get new functions if Fate offers him his stats, but that will cost every single stat point. Fate refuses, but Greed explains that if he doesn't, he won't be able to use him anymore. He then says that Fate can either be strong by himself, or he can make him Greed strong, and they work together. Fate decides to accept the deal and gives him his stats. Greed then starts transforming into a magic bow. He just needs to draw the bow and the arrow will appear. Fate decides to test it, and turns out the arrow can track the target, easily defeating a goblin that was nearby. He then decides to take the Goblin King's ears and drops them at Saraha's orphanage. He hopes the nuns will be able to feed the kids for a while. The next day, Roxy tries to sneak out of the house. Fate doesn't recognize her and tells her to stop moving, thinking she is a thief. She gets a jump scare and turns around. Fate apologizes for scaring her, mentioning she looks different than usual. He asks if she is heading to the castle, but she simply replies that she will go into town on a secret inspection. She tells Fate to not tell anyone, especially Haru, who will scold her for dressing that way. Fate promises to keep it a secret and tries to return to work. Roxy then decides to make it a date in her head. She tells him that Fate will escort her during the inspection. The two head off, but Roxy seems to be having too much fun. He tells her to slow down, but she tells him to stop calling her Roxy, otherwise, people will notice her. She then asks him to call her Lexi. Greed is making fun of Fate, who tells the sword to shut up. Roxy thinks those words were for her and apologizes for being annoying. He tries to dodge a bullet, and she feels relieved, explaining she's happy to hang out with him. Greed mocks their romantic moment, but Fate is tired of it and tries to throw it away. But Roxy stops him, telling him he cannot treat his weapon that way. She then realizes that she never took a look at his sword before. Fate realizes he's a big problem because someone with a worthless skill like him shouldn't have a sword. Plus, he cannot tell anyone about his gluttony skill. He ends up dropping the sword and Roxy picks it up. After taking a quick look, Roxy says that Greed needs some maintenance and promises to take him to her family's blacksmith. They then continue walking, and Fate tells Greed that he will finally be polished. But Greed doesn't reply. He tries to check what's going on, but Greed is simply taking his moment after being touched by Roxy. He then mentions that Roxy smells nice, making Fate want to throw him away. However, Roxy tells him to hurry up. They leave the alleyway and step into the city streets. It's filled with life, merchants, and all kinds of people. Roxy sees some good-looking grapes and stops. The merchant proudly explains those are from the Hart family vineyard. She wants to have a taste, and the merchant gives her two. Fate tastes one and finds it quite delicious. Roxy ends up spilling the beans, mentioning that it was cultivated at home. The merchant gets confused by her statement. Fate realizes she might be discovered, but Greed gives him an idea. Fate steps in, explaining to the merchant that one of her relatives works for the Hart family. The merchant gets convinced and walks away. She thanks him for saving her, but everyone's attention is drawn to something else. The Holy Knights are coming. The entire mood of the city vanishes away. Everyone goes silent and tries to look away. They're worried, not knowing what the Holy Knight is doing here. They all think the low-rank Holy Knights have been abusing their power ever since Roxy's father passed away. Yet, Fate's stomach makes noise when the guy is passing by. Greed makes fun of it, but the Holy Knight gets offended. He asks who made that noise and gets near Fate. Fate gets on his knees and tries to apologize, but the Holy Knight says he can't hear him. The knight is about to kick Fate's head, but Roxy intervenes. She explains Fate already apologized, but the brainless dude now starts picking on Roxy. He wonders who's this girl who's trying to talk back to a Holy Knight. But when he looks at her, he almost recognizes her. Everyone around then asks if that's not Roxy from the Hart family. Fate gets worried everyone will find the truth. But Greed gives him a plan to pretend they're lovers. Fate is so shocked that he repeats it out loud. Roxy hears it and thinks it's a great idea. She helps Fate get up and tries to play it up. She says that she prepared breakfast for him, but he didn't eat it. Fate tries to play it out, and they end up having their improvised romantic moment, to the point where even Greed thinks this is becoming quite awkward. Roxy is quite enjoying it and apologizes to the knight before walking away. Everyone then starts thinking that cannot be Roxy Hart, because Holy Knights cannot cook at all. The citizens disperse away, and Roxy drags Fate into an alleyway. She then thinks that she never linked arms with a boy before. But guess what? Fate can hear her thoughts. He hears that her heart is having quite a race and apologizes while distancing himself. She lies, saying that she's used to it, and starts happily walking away. Fate gets down, thinking it might be tough for him to escort Roxy. He notices that she stopped by a stall and sees her looking at a red gem. She explains that she's interested in them because she's a girl. She then notices some sort of rocks and asks the merchant if those are also gems. The merchant explains that's ore, it can have a gem inside or not. It's a try your luck buy. The merchant reveals it costs 10 bronze coins per ore and asks if she wants to try it. Greed explains that Fate can easily find out the best ones using his identify skill. Fate then tries to look at the rocks until he notices Roxy simply looking at a blue gem. He realizes that she seems like a normal girl instead of a holy knight. The merchant takes advantage of the moment, proposing a discount if Fate buys the gem to his girl. Fate gets shy, and Roxy decides to simply walk away. He follows her, and she asks if Fate has any warrior acquaintance. Fate asks about Minerva and Oliver, but Roxy explains she needs to talk to active warriors, not retired ones. He gets curious, but they're interrupted when they hear a conversation about the Goblin Massacre. Turns out people think it was a high-level monster who did it. Roxy then starts chasing the two guys who were talking about it. One of them thinks the monster theory is stupid because the Goblin King ears were donated to an orphanage. Roxy then interrupts the guys and asks about the details. She asks if they know anything about the roaming monster, but they don't and walk away. She then asks Fate to take her to where the warriors gather. He then realizes that Roxy is investigating the wandering monster who appeared around the city in the last few days. You also know him by Fate. He takes her to the bar and the barman, who thought Fate was dead, is surprised to see him alive. He introduces Roxy as his coworker, but the barman starts picking him up, mentioning that he disappeared for a while and now brings his girl. Fate gets flustered and worried that Roxy will be offended. Greed even mentions that he could lose his head. Roxy reacts by destroying her cup, not because she's angry, but because that's what she wants, to be clapped. They have a huge meal, and the barman explains what he knows about the mysterious goblin wiper. He literally explains that a warrior found a pile of goblins with their ears still intact. Roxy is confused because everyone would take the ears off to sell them for money. Therefore, she thinks it's a wandering monster that has migrated from another region. The barman explains that will be bad for business, making Fate confused. The barman goes into detail, saying that people must pass through the goblin plains if they want to do business in or out of the city. Therefore, people won't want to travel and it will destroy the city's economy. Fate starts realizing his mistake when an old man gets inside the bar. He thinks he's seeing a ghost because he also thought that Fate was dead. Turns out the old man also has some information. They think the roaming monster is a lick. Therefore, the Holy Knights will be taking direct action to deal with it. Greed tells Fate this will be a problem because he lost all his stats. Yet, Fate's biggest worry is if Roxy joins the hunt and sees him. A group of traveling warriors enters the bar, and you know, the typical behavior. They grab Roxy's shoulder and invite her to have some fun with them. Fate gets up to protect her, but she also gets up and uses her skill to push the guy against the wall. Everyone around realizes that only a holy knight could do something like that. She then reveals her identity and apologizes for trying to trick everyone. The warriors get on their knees to apologize in fear. They even try to pay her to stay alive. She tells them to put their money away because she doesn't want people to fear the Holy Knights, a group that should be protecting the weak. She reveals that she shares her late father's dream, to live in a world where everyone could laugh without caring about their status. The old man then realizes that Roxy is just like her father. At that moment, Fate promises to himself that he will follow Roxy until she accomplishes that dream. After having fun all together, Roxy takes Fate to the blacksmith. Greed loves the polishing massage and explains he will cut even faster. Fate thanks her for helping him perform maintenance to Greed. Roxy explains that he also helped her get more information about the wandering monster. Fate then gets curious and asks why she didn't know about the hunt. She explains that since her father passed away, the Vileric family is literally using the situation to deal with stuff without informing her. Suddenly, they hear two voices and check the commotion. They notice that Hado is pulling a kid's arm and Roxy tells him to release the kid. The girl claims they're just taking a lost kid into their protection. But Roxy orders Fate to help the kid. While doing it, the trio leader tries to talk to Fate, but our boy ignores him. Roxy then tells the trio she will be taking care of the kid and decides to question the leader. She asks why he didn't inform her about the wandering monster hunt. The guy tries to brush it off, saying he assumed she would be occupied thinking about her father. Roxy claims she's fine, but the guy just ignores her and walks away. Hado, the psycho, tells both the kid and Fate they're trash before walking away. The kid then reveals he hates Holy Knights, making Roxy apologize. He's confused, but Fate quickly asks if he got lost from his mother. The kid confirms, leading Fate and Roxy to help him look for his mother. Fate thinks that he also got lost when he arrived in the city 5 years ago. However, he was helped by a female Holy Knight. He wonders what happened to her because he has never seen her around since then. But we can clearly notice it was Roxy when she had short hair. After walking around for some hours, they still cannot find the kid's mother. However, she appears sometime later looking for her son. Fate is happy they managed to find her, and he gets enchanted when he sees Roxy's pure smile. She why he's staring at her, and he tries to make an excuse. He says that it's getting late and they need to return. Roxy then realizes the situation and makes him promise her one thing. If they get in trouble, they will do it together. He promises they will and they rush home, just to get scolded by the head maid. Later at night, Fate asks Greed if there's a way to hunt monsters without Roxy finding out. Greed suggests he gets a special mask. Upon checking it, he realizes it's a perception warping magic item. Greed explains that the mask will make him look different to whoever sees him. Fate thinks that's perfect and buys it. At the same time, he also ends up buying an ore from the other merchant. He gives the ore to Roxy, who's a bit confused by it. He simply explains that she's literally helping him in every aspect of his life and asks her to open. She does and notices a huge blue gem inside. She promises to treasure it and asks if he wants a year's supply of meat as a reward, or maybe a whetstone for sharpening Greed. You know Greed wants the whetstone, but Fate refuses both. Meanwhile, the Holy Knights are having a meeting without Roxy's consent, where the trio's leader claims they will discuss their excursion to Galia. During nighttime, several adventurers are out on the fields. They see the corpses of several goblins and think the monster has come around again. They are not happy they were not able to capture it. Meanwhile, Fate's standing over a pile of goblins with his new mask on. The adventurers see him and they run for their lives, thinking he's the lick. They call him Corpse. Greed tells him he likes his new name. He asks him if he isn't satisfied yet. Fate tells him he wants to get his stats as high as possible before the knights come after him. At the Hart family castle, Fate is casually pruning flowers. Leading a double life is really telling on him. Lady Roxy approaches him, telling him she has a secret mission for him. He asks her if it's going to be another inspection. Next we can see Fate in Lady Roxy's carriage. He doesn't look too happy. She points out a vast expanse of land belonging to the Hart family. He asks her if their secret mission involves harvesting grapes. She tells him she wants him to see their grape vineyard up close after seeing their grapes in the market. The carriage finally arrives at its destination and Aisha Hart, who is Roxy's mother, comes out to greet them. Roxy tells her she shouldn't have bothered, but her mother tells her she's feeling good enough to be able to. Roxy tells her not to overexert herself. Roxy's mother asks her who accompanied her. She introduces Fate to her mother as a servant she hired. They exchange pleasantries. Greed tells Fate he's relieved Aisha is nice. Aisha tells Fate to come closer. She asks him if he likes her daughter. Roxy is embarrassed by this question. She questions her mother, wondering why she asked Fate such a question. Aisha tells her she just wants to know his opinion about her as his employer. They are both relieved she means the business-wise relationship. Fate tells Aisha in all sincerity that he cares for Roxy and would serve her all his life if allowed. Roxy is embarrassed once again and rushes off to her room in a bid to hide it. Fate asks if he said something wrong. Aisha tells him it's typical Roxy behavior to run off, then things get uncomfortable. She tells him that she was little, she was always a crybaby that got scared of the littlest things. Fate says he couldn't tell that from the way she acts at the Capitol. Aisha tells him she can't believe her daughter turned out to be a holy knight. She tells him she worries Roxy is pushing herself too hard now that she's the head after her father passed. Fate tells her Roxy is a good holy knight who performs her duty well and is loved by the people. Aisha is happy to hear this. Roxy goes into her room and switches on a music box while looking at pictures of herself when she was younger. This triggers a memory of her father training her. He teaches her proper stance and sword handling. He is so proud she became a magic knight at such a young age. She tells him she wants to be just like him and be able to laugh along with the people. He tells her she chose the right path as a member of the Hart family. She comes back to the present, telling a figurine of her father that she has yet to fulfill her promise. At the vineyard, Fate joins other servants to harvest grapes. One of the servants offers him a cup of freshly juiced grapes. Fate thanks him. He takes a sip and compliments its sweetness. The servant explains how the lords and servants have worked together to make the grapes have such great flavor. Fate asks if Sir Mason also had a hand in this. The servant tells him he heard the sad news of his passing. He tells Fate they weren't sure Roxy would come around for the harvest because of that. He asks the servant if Roxy helped with the yearly harvest. He tells Fate that's one of the things she comes for, the other is hunting monsters. Fate asks about the monster hunting part. The servant tells him the current harvest time is not just for grapes but several food stuff. He tells Fate the monsters show up because they are usually hungry. He tells Fate they deal with a group of monsters in particular called kobolds. At that moment Fate's stomach growls. The servant hears it and tells him it's understandable he's hungry since he's been working all day. Fate's skill is acting up. Greed tells him that his skill is hungry for new monsters to consume, after consuming nothing but goblins. Later in the day, after storing the bags of grapes, Roxy tells Fate to return to the house without her. Fate walks down the path leading to the house and sees a girl walking towards him with a huge battle axe hoisted on her shoulder. He hasn't seen the girl around there before. As they walk beside each other, the girl calls out to him. When Fate looks at her eyes, they look just like his when he activates his skill. He tries to analyze her but can't get anything. She calls out to him again and he asks her what she wants. She tells him she came too early. Fate asks her what she means. She tells him she came for the kobolds but he can have them. She tells him he owes her one when they meet in the future. As she walks away, Fate asks Greed if he knows who she was. Greed tells him he has no idea who she is. Fate tells Greed he's hiding something from him. Greed asks him why he thinks that. Fate tells him he's usually more talkative but he's been quiet all through that day. Greed tells him he has nothing to hide. He says even in all his knowledge there are some things he doesn't know. Fate thinks he sounds too proud of being ignorant. At that point, Roxy meets up with Fate. She gives him a bag to hold on to. She tells him she went to get some grapes for herself. She looks back at the strange girl, telling Fate she's a Galian. Fate tells her Galia was destroyed. She tells him that's what she heard as well. She goes into a history lesson. She tells him 4,000 years ago Galia was a strong nation until a surge of monsters caused its collapse by eliminating all its citizens. Fate tells her apparently some citizens survived. She tells him she hasn't seen such a full-blooded Galian before. She tells Fate they should both head to the house together. Fate tells her he knows about her monster hunt and asks her if she'll be okay. She tells him she won't be alone because some warriors will accompany her. She also tells him he shouldn't worry since she's a magic knight after all. She turns back to flex her muscles but drops her basket of grapes in the process. The next day the vineyard is now a shadow of itself. The servants come to see it completely cleared out by the monsters and they're not happy about this. Next we see the monsters close to a stream. Fate, Roxy and some warriors are watching them behind the cover of some trees close to the stream. Fate asks Roxy if the monsters are kobolds. One of the soldiers notices monsters within a bush. He points everyone's attention to it and a giant kobold emerges. Both Fate and Roxy are surprised by the appearance of the monster. They've never seen a kobold that huge before. Fate's mouth starts to water and his skill yearns for some kobold dish. Greed tells him his mouth is watering because he's nearly out of time. Fate doesn't want to enter his starvation state while close to Roxy. He analyzes the monster to see its level and unique attributes. Greed tells him it's a crowned beast. Fate doesn't know what that is. Greed tells him it's a monster born from the accumulation of aggression over a long time. He tells him it's nothing like the usual monsters and could be very difficult to deal with. They all retreat to come up with a plan. The soldiers and the villagers are scared and don't know what to do. Roxy assures them she'll slag the beast since she's a holy knight. She tells them she will dedicate her power to protect them all. While she reassures them, Greed tells Fate she can't handle the monster on her own because she's too young. Meanwhile, Roxy tells the soldiers to prepare for battle, but they tell her they'll need until the next day to be fully prepared. She tells them to do what they must. Greed asks Fate his next course of action. Fate thinks a level 50 monster is too much for him to handle at that moment. However, he thinks he can't just ignore all that's happening, and worst of all, he can't let any harm come to Roxy. Fate decides to take on the monsters all by himself. Fate goes back to the stream to find the kobolds there. The crowned beast has some kobold warriors guarding it, with several junior kobolds moving with the pack as well. Greed asks Fate for his next course of action. Fate tells him he's going to fight like a glutton. He pulls him out and takes down several junior kobolds. He shoots at the crowned beast, but it uses one of its warriors to block the shot. The others try to protect the crowned beast, but Fate takes them down. After taking down all the kobolds and his gluttony skill absorbing their skills, he's not convinced he has enough to take down the crowned beast. He shoots at the crowned beast, thinking he can bring him down, but it catches both his arrows. Both Greed and Fate are surprised he caught it. Greed tells Fate to get close to it and fight it with his sword form. Fate rushes in without thinking. The crowned beast releases a skill which Greed warns Fate about, but it's too late. Fate is hit by the skill, but he manages to heal himself. The crowned beast launches the skill again, which knocks Fate out. Greed tries to get him back on his feet, but he doesn't respond. The crowned beast tries to land the finishing blow, but it loses its arm in a split second. Fate is back on his feet. Greed praises him for tricking the crowned beast into thinking he was knocked out cold. The crowned beast launches its skill again, but Fate dodges out of the way. But he is hit mid-air by a kobold warrior. Fate ends the kobold warrior and absorbs his stats with his gluttony skill. At this point, Greed tells him he can use his first level hidden art, but he will need 10% of his stats for it. Fate tells him to take it so they can end the crowned beast. Greed transforms into a huge special bow. As Fate charges Greed's skill, the crowned beast also charges his skill. They both launch their skills at the same time, but Greed's skill surpasses that of the crowned king. It literally gives him a shortcut to heaven. Greed tells Fate the regeneration skill he got from the Goblin King has already healed him. Fate is exhausted from the fight. Fate tells Greed his skill was overkill when he sees the after effect. Fate's skill activates and he feels like he's in a frenzy. Greed tells him he is overloaded from devouring a monster with a higher level than him. He tells Fate to try to hold it in or he'll enter a state worse than his starvation state. Fate falls to his knees and screams out in pain. The next day, Roxy and the soldiers arrive at the lake to see the slain kobolds. They see sword and arrow marks and Roxy thinks they were caused by magic. She sees the after effect of Greed's skill, wondering who could have done such a thing. Back at the house, Roxy is explaining everything to Aisha with Fate sitting close to her as well. Fate apologizes internally. Aisha asks Roxy who could have done such a thing. Roxy wrongly thinks it was the Gallian girl she saw the previous day. Fate is happy she doesn't suspect him. Roxy is happy the kobolds were taken down and they can return to the capital. Aisha is happy. Roxy looks so excited around Fate. Later in the day, Aisha calls Fate to her bedroom and asks him to stay by Roxy's side to support her. Fate doesn't think he's worthy, but Aisha tells him he just needs to have a desire to help her. She tells him that was how she was able to support her husband though she was a commoner. She tells Fate that having a single magic knight parent caused a bit of problems for Roxy. At that point she coughs for a while and Fate rushes to hold her up. She tells him her time is running out, which is why she wants him to look out for Roxy in her place. She begs him and tells him to take his time to think about it. Fate agrees. The next day they leave the house in their carriage and head back to the capital. Fate thinks he's not worthy of the duty given to him by Aisha since he's deceiving the world by carrying the gluttony skill. At night Fate slays more goblins, but he's still in his starvation state. He wonders why his hunger isn't satiated. Greed tells him goblins are not enough to do that anymore. Fate tells him there are no monsters other than goblins around there. Greed tells him he has to come up with something because time is running out. The next day Fate is at the tavern with an eye patch over his right eye. He thinks he's not worthy to stand before Roxy. The door to the tavern opens and the bartender's friend comes in. He tells the bartender Sir Hado is going to join the hunt for corpse. Fate is surprised by this. The bartender tells his friend it's Sir Hado's way of getting some glory from completing an easy task. His friends tell him Sir Hado is better off going for the Galia expedition. The bartender tells him Sir Hado only goes where it's safest for him. Fate is surprised there's another expedition so soon after Sir Mason's death. The bartender's friend tells him everything will be in place soon and he hopes things will work out well this time. Fate is shocked. At the knight's house, several knights are preparing to head off for the expedition, including Roxy and the trio knights. Before leaving, Roxy visits her father's grave and tells him all that's happened, asking him to watch over her. Fate advises her not to go because she might not return. She tells him she has decided to go and walks away. Greed tells Fate the Vuelarix family arranged for the Galia expedition because they have something against the Hart family. The trio knights are happy they'll be able to get rid of Roxy once and for all. While Hado will be going for the Galia expedition with the hopes of doing away with Roxy, the other two will be going to another city for research. Hado thinks they're hiding something from him and wants in on what they will be going to do. Raphael just tells him to make sure he takes care of Roxy. Later at night, though Fate cannot disobey direct orders or protect Roxy, there is one thing he can do. He stands in the way of Sir Hado and his patrol. Sir Hado comes face to face with him, happy to have found Corpse. Fate activates his skill. Hado is happy to finally come face to face with Corpse. His henchmen leap forward with their weapons drawn and try to attack Fate. Fate activates his skill. Noticing his attackers are so slow it looks like they are not moving at all. Greed tells him it's because of the difference in their stats. As they close the distance to Fate, he brings down all three henchmen one by one. Hado doesn't look so confident anymore. Fate looks back at him and his henchmen ditch him faster than the speed of light. Even Einstein would be impressed. Hado tries to rally them but his henchmen leave him standing there alone to face Fate. Fate walks up to him and Hado draws his sword. Fate takes off his mask and Hado immediately recognizes him. Hado asks him how a commoner like him became so strong. Fate tells him he doesn't owe him an explanation. Fate tells Hado to show him the knight powers he's so proud of. Fate activates his skills and looks at Hado's stats. The Holy Sword technique catches his eye. It's the special skill needed to become a holy knight. Fate wonders how Hado got such a skill. He asks Greed if he can shatter a holy sword. Greed tells him he has an edge over a measly artificial holy sword. Hado tells him it will be foolish to face him in a sword fight. Hado activates the skill and strikes at Fate. He thinks his strike will disintegrate Fate instantly, but Fate is already out of the way. Hado is shocked and Fate lands behind him. He tells him his skill takes way too long to launch. Hado turns around and strikes at Fate with his sword, but Fate simply slices his holy sword into two. Hado looks shocked at half of his sword. Fate casually catches the other half and drops it to the ground. He asks Hado to pick it up and continue the fight. Hado backs away from Fate and considers taking to his heels. Fate reads his body language and tells him not to run but to uphold his pride as a holy knight. Hado keeps backing up. Fate tells him he's pathetic. Hado trips and falls and Fate calls him a clown. Fate lifts him up like a ragdoll and reminds him of a statement he made. Defiant dogs need to be taught discipline. Hado begs him to stop but runs to a tree and gives Hado's face a nice makeover. Fate keeps falling trees around the forest with Hado's face until he's unrecognizable. Hado begs him once again to stop. Fate is pissed he has the nerve to beg considering how he treated other people like meaningless trash. Fate is also angry Roxy would be walking into danger because of him. Hado begs him to spare his life and Fate asks him what his response was when he told him the same thing. He throws Hado into the air and activates Greed's skill. Greed turns into a crossbow and Fate fires several shots at Hado while he's still in the air. When Hado finally lands on the ground, his limbs are gone. Hado asks him why he won't finish him off and begs him to end his sorrow. Fate tells him he has a question for him first. Hado asks him if it's about Roxy. He recalls her volunteering for the Galia expedition and how she vowed to give her life to save the people. Fate confirms that Roxy would indeed say those words. Hado promises to cancel Roxy's Galia expedition if Fate spares his life. Fate raises Greed over Hado's chest. Hado begs him not to do anything stupid like getting revenge for Roxy. Fate tells him to shut his mouth and gives Greed a taste of Hado's innards. His skill activates and his stats increase. Fate now gains the Holy Knight technique. Greed tells him he has now become a Holy Knight. Greed tells him he can use Hado's stats to access his second level. Fate gives him the go-ahead and Greed takes up his stats. He transforms into his second level, which is a great scythe. Greed tells Fate his blade can now cut through anything in the universe. The next day, Roxy prepares to leave. The servants stand around her to see her off, but they don't look too happy. She tells them not to look so gloomy because 3 years will pass by in a flash. She tells Haru to look after things in her absence. She comes face to face with Fate and they stare at each other for a while. She assures him they will meet again. Fate tells her to take care of herself and she leaves. Later, Haru gives Fate a letter of recommendation Roxy left for him. Roxy recommended him to a lord's manor to keep him safe. However, Fate rejects it and tells Haru he will make a way for himself as a warrior. Fate packs his belongings. Greed asks him if he has made up his mind. He tells Greed if he can't stop Roxy from traveling, the least he can do is to support her. Fate bids farewell to the other servants and Haru hands him his pay for the work he has done. She wishes him good luck and he leaves. He enters a public carriage, hoping that he's strong enough to protect Roxy. Roxy stands before a group of knights and other soldiers. She tells them she has taken up her father's role of bringing down the dragon and keeping the royal capital and its people safe. She asks them for their help and everyone cheers in unison. Roxy walks down the podium and Miria calls out to her. Miria tells her Roxy she will follow her wherever she goes. A male soldier walks up to Roxy and tells her he volunteered as well. He introduces himself and Mugen and they exchange pleasantries. Miria stereotypes him, telling him he's one of the people who are excited at a chance to see and test their mettle against the dragon. Mugen tells her she is spot on. Miria thinks he's just another foolish warrior. Mugen tells her the real reason he volunteered was because he once marched under Sir Mason's orders. He tells them he would like to avenge him, and Roxy thanks him. Roxy asks him if his family doesn't oppose his trip to Galia. He tells her his daughter even asked him to come back with some Gallian relics. He tells her he comes from a lineage of scholars who do research and he's the only warrior. Roxy laughs and tells them she thinks the expedition will go well with them by her side. At the laboratory, the female scientist asks Rain for her attention. She asks her if she knows about the lick everyone in town is talking about. She shows Rain the slain goblins and observes the arrow marks aren't normal arrow marks. Rain takes a close look and is fascinated by it. She opens up a book and shows the female scientist a magic bow. She tells her she thinks that the arrow from that magic bow did it. The female scientist asks her if magic arrows are different from fireballs. Ryan tells her it's an ability possessed by the Black Sword, one of the weapons of mortal sin. Weapons of mortal sin are made from special materials that can manipulate magic at a high level. Those weapons can control magic power, and Rain thinks they can increase the skills of whoever wields them. Meanwhile, Fate is resting in the public carriage and wakes up when they arrive in the town of Tetra. Fate walks up a flight of stairs and looks over the city below him. He is nostalgic because the city has hardly changed. Greed asks him if he's been to the city before and he tells him he was here 5 years ago. He tells Greed he passed through the town on his way to the capital. Fate approaches a carriage driver and asks him if he is heading to Galia. The driver tells him his carriage won't be going today because they could be attacked by monsters at night. He tells him to come back tomorrow. Fate walks away quickly. Fate's stomach growls. Greed tells him to get something to eat and gather information before going shopping. Greed tells him if the town has a bug trading center, he may find a scabbard for him. Fate is surprised Greed still needs a scabbard. Greed tells him he has the Holy Sword's technique now, and he needs a scabbard befitting of his stats. He gives Fate an idea of the kind of scabbard he would like. Fate would like to have some meat after getting his pay from Haru. Greed asks him if he's listening to his preferences. At the local pub, Set is asking several warriors to help save his village. They brush away his money, telling him it's not to get them to hunt monsters. They start bullying Set and Fate comes to his rescue. He easily overpowers the bully and pushes him to the ground. The other warriors try to fight Fate, but he overpowers them. They run away from the pub. The man tries to thank Fate but cuts him off, telling him he hasn't seen him in a long time. In the past, Fate was bullied by Set and his friends who called him a good-for-nothing. Fate's father was a warrior who used to fight against monsters. Fate would always make herbs for his father because he was always injured. His father was impressed that Fate was so good at making herbal mixtures. After Fate's dad passed away, the villagers wondered who would look after him now that his dad is gone. Fate was exiled because the village chief thought he was useless. The villagers chased him away from the village, calling him a good-for-nothing. Back to the present, Set knelt before Fate, begging for his help. Fate remembers Set, who is the son of the village chief who exiled him. Set tells him he knows his request is selfish, but he tells him he needs a warrior's strength. Fate just looks back at him angrily without answering. Greed tells him it's a good opportunity to satiate his skill, gluttony. Fate agrees to handle the monster problem. Set thanks him, saying he was unsure Fate would accept. Fate tells him to lead the way to the monsters. Fate still resented Set for what he did when he was younger, but he had to save the village which bore memories of his father. Set leads him back to the village, but the village chief who is Set's dad isn't happy to see Set returned with Fate, who was exiled by them. Set's dad thinks he's still a useless good-for-nothing. Set tells his dad that Fate is strong now and recounts how he defeated the warriors at the pub. His dad doesn't believe him, and he tells the villagers that he will find formidable warriors the next day. One of the villagers tells him monsters could attack them that night, and they may not last till the next day. Set's dad tells them they will use Fate as bait to buy more time for other warriors to come. Fate tries to say something, but Set begs him to pay no attention to the chief. Set takes Fate to his house and offers him a beverage. Set apologizes for the way the chief behaved, and Fate tells him he's used to it. Fate asks after Set's wife because he hasn't seen her, and Set tells him the monsters got to her. Set tells Fate the village is too poor and the village chief has all the authority. Set tells Fate he thought his father was always right, but since he had his daughter he had to get his act together. Fate tells him he has really changed. Set tells Fate it's all thanks to his daughter, which makes Fate remember his late father. Fate asks Set to tell him about the monsters. Set tells him the monsters showed up about a month ago and witnesses think they are multiple monsters that can fly. He tells Fate these monsters are unlike anything the village has ever seen before. That's why they decided to hire some warriors. Just then Fate's stomach growls. Set teases him about always being hungry and goes to get Fate something to eat. Greed tells Fate the villagers probably think things would get better if they hired a few warriors, but if the monsters can fly it's a different story entirely. Fate asks Greed if he knows the kind of monsters attacking the village. Greed tells him the monsters are most likely gargoyles. He tells Fate they are smart monsters who use probe attacks to see how humans react before the full pack attacks together. Set's daughter walks up to Fate and asks him who he's talking to. Fate tells her he's talking to himself. She gives him a piece of candy. Fate asks her if she would like to play and she agrees. Fate puts Greed away and arm wrestles with her. He lets her win easily and she laughs happily. Set comes back with some food, apologizing for how small it is. Fate tells him it's more than enough and thanks him for the meal. Fate takes a bite from the food and immediately becomes very tired. He passes out right after. Set wonders what made him pass out and Set's daughter tells him she gave him some candy. Set asks her about it and she tells him Set's dad gave it to her. Set is surprised his father is really serious about using Fate as bait. Greed understands that Fate has been drugged. Set tries to wake him up but then a scream pierces through the night. Set looks out the window and he's shocked at the sight before him. The gargoyles are attacking the village. The gargoyles begin attacking the village by breathing out flames. Set is still trying to wake up the unconscious Fate but he isn't responding. But Greed knows he's not going to wake up. A gargoyle lands on the roof of Set's house and Greed wonders what he can do. Set makes the antidote for Fate. Meanwhile, the village is glowing a bright orange in the dark night. The village chief is running down the street looking for Fate so he can be used as bait. The gargoyle picks him up and knows dinner is settled for the night. Set gives Fate the antidote and he wakes up. He throws up and Fate is impressed Set was able to make an antidote. Fate doesn't recognize where he is, and Set apologizes while telling him everything. Flames flare outside Set's house which jolts Fate into action. He picks up Greed and heads outside. The village is in complete rubble. Every house is on fire and most villagers have been given a free pass to the afterlife. Fate tries to find survivors but the sight of the village weakens his spirits. The gargoyles are still busy having dinner and Fate comes face to face with one. The gargoyle launches a breath of flame at Fate who dodges it. Greed tells him he can't match the gargoyles if they have the high ground. Fate listens to him, unlike a certain Jedi we know. Fate analyzes the skills of the gargoyles and looks over their stats. Fate thinks its fireball skill is troublesome and orders Greed to transform into a scythe. The gargoyle launches a fireball at Fate once again. Instead of dodging it, he cuts through it. The gargoyles notice that Fate is putting up a fight and they all surround him. They launch their fireballs at him simultaneously. Fate uses the scythe, which cuts through the fireball and then cuts through the gargoyles one after the other. Fate's gluttony skill activates, his stats increase, and he gets the fireball magic skill. Fate notices there is still one gargoyle left. This is the pack leader. Fate analyzes the leader and notices he has a higher level than normal gargoyles and an additional skill of fire resistance. The leader lunges at Fate to use a fireball at point blank range, but Greed warns Fate about it and tells him to take advantage of that. Fate immediately lunges at the diving leader. Fate strikes the leader down with the scythe and his gluttony skill activates. Fate's stats increase once again, and he gets the skill of fire resistance. The next day, Fate and Set stand over what's left of the village. Only Set and a few other villagers survived the attack. Set is a bit sad and tells Fate there's no point staying around because the place can't be called a village anymore. Fate analyzes the land and tells him the ground is no longer fertile, so they won't be able to farm. Set asks him if he has the skill of appraisal, to which Fate affirms. Set tells him he could earn money as an appraiser even if he didn't become a warrior. Fate tells him he has no other way to live his life except being a warrior. Set tells him he will move to the city and search for a job for the sake of his daughter. Later, Set asks Fate to punch him so he can make up his mind. Fate is reluctant, but Greed tells him to punch him to maintain Set's pride. Fate gives in and knocks him to the ground. Greed tells Fate he punched Set too hard, but Set thanks him for the punch. Fate helps him back up to his feet and tells him to take care of his daughter and wishes him good luck. Fate returns to his old family house and goes to the grave site of his parents. The site brings back memories of his childhood and he tells his father he's doing good now. Meanwhile, Roxy is moving through the desert with her entourage. She stops to look at the horizon. Miria tells her they will soon arrive at Lanchester, where they will resupply. Mugen tells her to be careful of the Lord of Lanchester. Roxy asks him why and he tells her he'll tell her later. Back to Fate, who is in a carriage. The carriage driver asks him if he will be able to protect him if he's so sleepy. Fate apologizes to him. The driver tells Fate he's paying him for his services, so he better ensure his safety. Greed tells Fate the man is being arrogant. Fate reassures the man of his safety, telling him he's as strong as a rookie holy knight. The man is convinced of Fate's strength now, though he thinks he's prideful. Suddenly, the man brings the carriage to a halt. Bandits stand in front of the carriage. The man wants to turn the carriage and run away, but Fate comes out and faces the bandits. Greed tells Fate he should have asked the man for more money. The man rushes to Fate and holds on to him, begging him to save his life. Fate tells the man to let him go so he can fight the bandits. The leader of the bandits rallies his men to attack him and Fate. At that moment, a huge sword falls from the sky behind the group of bandits, breaking their formation and knocking them to the ground. Greed tells Fate there's only one person who can do that. Fate looks up to see the girl he saw some days back. She then tells Fate he owns her for those kobolds. Fate doesn't understand what she means. She asks to join them, but when she gets on the carriage it tilts backward. The girl yells her weapon, Sloth, to go back to normal, and the carriage rights itself. The carriage continues the journey and the girl asks Fate what his name is. Fate introduces himself to her and she calls him Fate of Gluttony. Fate asks her how she knows about gluttony, and she replies she's also a deadly sin skill owner. Fate asks her about the deadly sin skill and she asks him if Greed didn't tell him about it. The girl introduces herself as Mine with the skill of Wrath. Her stomach rumbles and Fate gives her some beef jerky. The driver tells them they are about to arrive in the city. They arrive at the city, but a girl is being chased by people who do not do a good job of disguising themselves as ghosts. The girl cries for help and Lord Rudolph, the Lord of Lanchester, comes to her aid, defeating the ghosts. Everyone praises him, but Fate and Mine are indifferent towards the clown show. The driver tells them Lord Rudolph is preparing a welcome party for the expedition of Galia's army. Fate asks the driver if it's Lady Roxy's expedition and the driver tells him it's her expedition and they would be arriving at the town soon. Greed tells him he was so busy trying to catch up that he passed them by and Fate heaves a sigh of relief. The man presents Fate's payment of 3 golf coins to him, but Mine takes it, telling Fate she was the one who saved the man. Greed tells Fate Mine is greedy and Fate tells him he's one to talk. The driver thanks Fate and walks away. Fate asks Greed what they should do, and Greed tells him they should go to an inn. Mine falls asleep while standing and she rests on Fate for support. Fate tells her not to fall asleep while standing. She doesn't respond and Fate carries her through the city looking for an inn. Fate wonders why he has to carry her, and Greed tells him he has no choice. Strangers welcome Fate to the city. As they walk away, Fate notices strange marks on their necks. Fate gets to a guarded point and the guards tell him he can't go through because he's not a citizen. They point him towards an inn, and he notices these guards also have marks on their necks, but theirs are different from the one he saw on the strangers earlier. Another stranger welcomes Fate and he notices a different mark. Greed tells him the marks were given according to class in a caste system. Rudolph scolds the actors in a secluded area for their poor performance, and they beg for his forgiveness, but he strikes them down. Rudolph's personal guards note he's more frustrated than usual, and they make a mental note not to offend him. Fate drops Mine on a bed in a room he got at an inn. Greed tells Fate he had no idea Mine was still alive. Fate asks him how he knows Mine, and he says he was in a bad relationship with her and Sloth in the past. Greed tells Fate Sloth is a deadly sin weapon just like him. Fate asks him about deadly sin skills, and Greed tells him about the 7 deadly sin skills which violate God's principles. He tells Fate Gluttony is the most sinful skill because it can break through the concept of levels. Fate asks Greed if his punishment is his insatiable hunger, and Greed tells him they all have their individual punishments. Fate tells Greed he's quite unlucky, going from people laughing at him for being powerless to having to constantly feed his skill to survive. Greed tells him he can't hesitate if he wants to survive, or he'll be consumed by gluttony. Greed tells him to resist and maintain a half-starvation mode. Fate puts on his mask and gets out to hunt. Greed tells him not to satiate his skill at once but step by step. Fate comes across a sandman and he turns Greed into a bow. Greed tells him to cache his new fire skill before shooting the arrow, and Fate is impressed with the results. The sand is defeated easily. Fate's skill activates. He sees other sandmen and wants to devour them, but Greed tells him to endure it. At the inn, Mine wakes up and she's hungry. She gets something to eat but comes across a poster that says whoever defeats the sand golem will be rewarded. A stranger tells her even Lord Rudolph cannot defeat the sand golem and she will lose her life if she tries. Fate keeps taking down the sandmen one at a time and activating his skill little by little. Greed tells him he's getting used to it, and Fate tells him the feeling isn't very pleasant. Greed tells him it's time for him to satisfy gluttony so he doesn't go berserk. The sand golem appears, and Fate recognizes its smell immediately. A group of soldiers are fighting the sand golem, but they have no chance of defeating it. At that point, Fate hits the golem with a magic arrow to draw its attention. He tells the soldiers he'll take down the golem, but they tell him he's no match for the golem. Greed tells him he's pulling an act of justice again, but Fate tells him he just wants to satiate his hunger. The golem shoots balls of sand, but Fate uses a magic arrow to destroy them. He lunges at the golem and tries to attack it, but the golem blocks it. The golem attacks Fate with wind magic to trap him so he can crush him with rocks. Fate transforms Greed into the scythe and slashes at the golem, which storms the wind magic. The core of the golem leaves its body and buries itself in the sand. Greed tells Fate not to let the core disappear, and Fate turns Greed into a bow and tells him to take some of his stats. Fate gives Greed the order to fire at will, and he does, destroying the core of the sand golem. Fate's skill activates and he obtains the skill of Sandstorm Magic. Fate thinks the crater created by Greed's arrow is too big, but Greed tells him they had no choice. One of the warriors commends him, but another tells him he looks suspicious. They laugh it off and they thank him for saving their lives. The warrior introduces himself as Baldo and asks Fate what his name is. Fate tells him his name is Corpse. The warrior asks him if all he carries is a sword, and he tells the warrior that's all he carries. Greed tells him he doesn't need any more equipment because he can just take the stats of other players. Fate is impressed with his power, which allows him to break the concept of levels. The next day, Fate returns to the room to see Mine getting dressed. He asks her where she's heading and she tells him she's going to hunt the sand golem. Fate tells her he's taken the sand golem down and she is furious she won't get the bounty. Fate tells her he will give her half of it when he cashes in the bounty. He wears his mask and goes to collect the bounty. Mine asks him about his mask and he tells her it's his identity as Corpse. Lord Rudolph enters the inn and asks Fate to become his subordinate. Fate asks him what his deal is and he tells Fate he can't refuse his decision because he's a holy knight. Mine tells him Fate can be his subordinate because she already has an arrangement with him. Rudolph calls her a kid and she smacks him out of the inn with her axe. Fate knows this spells trouble for them and immediately tells Mine they need to leave the city. Fate comes out of the inn and asks a carriage driver for a ride. Watch this next video. See you on the next one.